First thing, I'd like to welcome everybody to the, yeah, I forgot the name of it. The Veterans Celebration. It's been a long month, I'll tell you. And I'm on a committee and I forgot it. That's pretty bad.
My name, we're in big trouble.
Yeah. Well, I try to forget his name sometimes.
That's his name.
But we're going to get started with this, and I have the honor of introducing an old friend of mine. He was a combat Marine, recon Marine in Vietnam, won 2 Purple Hearts. Come back here, joined the state police, retired from the state police. Works awful hard around the county with the Historical Association and also with the French Creek Archaeological Club. They do a lot of good stuff here, but you never see him. Normally he's up in a bell tower somewhere with the bats. He cataloged every bell. I think he can show you where every church in the county is. So, and he's got an extremely interesting presentation. So let's get started right now.
How much do I owe you?
That's not enough.
Hey, you gotta give better than a 5.
Sandy Porter.
I want to thank you for being here today. Can you hear me? I'm not going to use the microphone, but if you have trouble hearing me, let me know and I'll use the microphone. It's just as easy. Today we're going to talk about Lieutenant General Levin Campbell Jr. He was Chief of Ordnance from 1942 to 46, and he proudly said, from Pearl Harbor to VJ Day, the industry ordnance team furnished the Army and 43 foreign nations 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition and approximately 11 million tons of artillery ammunition. And between 1942-45, there were 71 million rounds of other ammunition calibers spilled from the Army munitions plant. So this emphasizes the fact that one of the most important industries during World War II was the manufacture of ordnance and ammunition. Today we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk to you about one of the most extensive and exotic facets of Crawford County's history. A lot of people aren't aware of this. The younger generation doesn't even know it ever existed, and the older generation, we recall it. It was the Keystone Ordnance Works. It was commonly called the TNT or the KOW. It was a common phrase for it. And I'm sure, do we have anybody here that their parents may have worked at the KOW? Okay. Now, what we have is the KOW was an ordnance plant. It was designed, there were 2 ordnance plants in Sandusky, Ohio, and Ravenna at that time. And they went over there and they designed the Keystone Ordnance Plant that was built in Crawford County after those plants. Now, the main purpose of the plant was the manufacture of TNT, which is called trinitrotoluene. Toluene is the official name, the chemical name, but it's easier to just say TNT. Now, it was an important explosive. It was famous for its shattering power, and it was used extensively throughout the war. Now, it was an important explosive for the following reasons. It could safely be manufactured, fairly safely. It was stable in moisture, and it had good explosive properties, and it could be stored for long periods of time. And it was not easily detonated, such as dynamite, and it melts at a temperature of 175 degrees, and it could be melted down, it could be poured into any object and shaped. In other words, when you're making artillery shells, hand grenades, whatever, it was manufactured in what they called a flake form, which was a solid form. It looked like yellow cornmeal, and I'll show you here. This is what flake TNT looked like. This is what was manufactured at the Keystone Ordnance here at Crawford County. It was manufactured in a more or less solid form. Then it was shipped from the TNT plant. This is a close-up of it. And you can see here, this was a photograph. I'm going to show you photographs today. Some of them were taken by the Army during the war. They were confidential at the time. At the Historical Society, we have copies of these, or we have some of the originals. So you're going to see some of it. But the nice thing about it was it could be melted down. It had a low melting point. It could be melted down. And this is a plant in Eldred, PA, where they're loading mortar shells. This wasn't done at the TNT. TNT mainly manufactured the flake TNT. Then it was shipped to other plants where it was melted down. These are photographs that show them the process of actually loading the shells with liquid TNT. And that was the advantage to it. It could be poured into anything. It could be shaped any way that they want it to be. And this photograph here shows you where they've shaped it in the can or whatever. So that was one of the advantages of it. Now, the chemicals, some of the chemicals, I'm going to simplify this without getting too much in depth as far as the chemical process. It's a complicated process, but basic toluene was used, nitric acid, liquid ammonia, and sulfuric acid were three of the main components that were used in manufacturing TNT. At the plant now, the toluene had to be shipped in by tank cars, and the liquid ammonia was shipped in by tank cars. But the sulfuric acid was actually manufactured at the TNT plant. And I'll show you this a little later. Okay, the area that the TNT plant was located was in Greenwood Township. And you can see here, here's Meadville. And those of you familiar with the area, here's Route 19. And we know where today, for a reference, where the PPG plant is in Greenwood Township, which was part of the complex. And the area in which the KOW, it encompassed most of Greenwood Township. The site covered 22 square miles and 15,000 acres of land. That's a lot of land. And the government paid at the time for it $560,000, which by today's standards isn't a lot, but back then it was. When it was finished, the plant complex consisted of 506 buildings, and figure this one out. The total floor area was 987,319 square feet. I'm not even going to try to figure that one out. And today remaining, there's some 50-odd structures. And it was one of the largest munitions plants in the country. One of the questions that gets posed to me is how many munitions plants were there in the United States during World War II, and I can't answer that. I've searched, but I cannot find any doc that gives an exact number. But the plant was one of the largest. Now, you ask, one of the questions, my first question you say is, why Crawford County? Why here in Crawford County, in the middle of nowhere? Well, one of the reasons was the water supply. You have the swamp down there, near there. There were large amounts of water were needed to manufacture TNT. There were 18 wells were dug near the marsh in French Creek near Cochran. There were 6 underground reservoirs that they had, and they had a 100,000-gallon elevated tank and 3 75,000-gallon tanks that they used for water. And per day now, to manufacture TNT per day, they used 25 million gallons of water. That's a lot of water by any standard you want to measure it by. One of the other reasons was they had a railroad connection there. Another one was the topography of the land. They liked the way the land was laid out. It was rural, it was isolated, and land was relatively cheap. And it could be obtained at a reasonable price. And one of the other main reasons, and this might sound odd to you, cloud cover. Crawford County, we're notorious for clouds. The sun doesn't shine here too often. Well, they're building a plant in 1942. We've entered into a war. There's the strong possibility that we could be bombed by either the Japanese or the Germans. So they're looking at a plant. Cloud cover is a great thing to have. Planes have a hard time bombing when they have clouds underneath them. So this was one of the things. So in November of 1941, the appraisers started contacting local residents in the area, and many of these residents had no prior knowledge. They didn't know that there was plans to build a plant here. And the land was quickly appraised and it was quickly purchased. It was a done deal before they even went in there. And the appraisers, they mainly appealed to the residents' patriotic duty, and most of the residents that were there that were displaced didn't feel at the time the government offered them money for their land. Most of them felt that they weren't being offered a fair price. And a few of the residents, they challenged the government authority, and they were warned, quote, condemnation procedure under the right of eminent domain is used only as a last resort. In other words, you take what we offer or we're going to take it anyhow. They had no choice. We're looking at coming into a war situation. The government needed the plant, and they were going to build this plant one way or the other. Today, the war would have been over before the plant got built, because there would have been so much litigation going on. There would have been thousands of attorneys. It probably, the plant would have never got built. But back then, it was a different story. And the majority of the residents within the proposed safety zone area of the KOW were given until the spring of 1942 to move. And some of there were 18 families within the proposed site of the manufacturing administrative areas, and they were actually given 15 days to vacate their property. Now imagine you're a third generation family with your farm there, and somebody shows up at your door one night and says, you got 15 days to pack up and get out. Pretty traumatic. And the government, some of these families had to move in the middle of winter. The government didn't provide much transportation. It was mainly neighbors helping neighbors, which is typical of Crawford County. There were 166 families that were relocated. Now, later on, at the end of the war, the government did let some of the people come back. They had the opportunity to purchase some of the land. The majority of them didn't come back. There's a paper that was written by, Mercer County History has it, we have it at the Crawford. A woman by the name of Lou Ann Rung did a paper on the whole relocation process. It's very interesting. She did a lot of research. She interviewed some of the people. So if you want to know more about this, you can read this paper. It was quite an interesting paper. Now this is the topo map. This is 19, the bridge coming down. This is where PPG is at. This is the general area of where the plant was located. And the plant was basically divided up, main areas of the plant, and I'm simplifying this for you. They called it a TNT area. And this TNT area, what they called the TNT lines, and then they were lines of buildings where the TNT was actually manufactured. They originally wanted to have 18 lines, but they only ever had 12 original lines. They had an area over here which is called the acid and powder area. And this was mainly, they had plants, they had a lab here, they had plants. This is where they manufactured, they used a form of sulfuric acid that they manufactured there. They called it an oleum plant. You also had an administrative area here where you had your offices, your main gate. You had an area down here where they had staff quarters. And you also had an area, a storage area here, and I'll go into more detail. This is just an aerial view. This was taken several years ago that shows the basic layout of the plant. This would be where PPG is at today. This is a layout of the plant. You had the lines of manufacture. These are what they called the lines. These were where they actually manufactured the TNT, and the lines, they were broken down. They had what they called a flake house, a wash house, mon houses, tri houses, different houses that were involved in this. And this was the area where they had the labs, they had the chemical plants. This is a better diagram showing you the layout of the plant, the basic layout of it. You had your water tanks. This is an aerial view. It was taken in 1960, but this shows the buildings were still standing. This was your area back here where you had your manufacturing. This is where the TNT was actually manufactured. This is where you have your power plant. You have your labs, your chemical plant. You had a railroad siding right here. This has been the administrative area. Another view. And this is the Tribune Republic, and this is the War Department to construct big explosives plant near Meadville. Now, some of these photographs are actual photographs that were taken by the government. This is showing the construction. I've got a lot of photographs to go through, so I'm going to go through in a hurry here. This matter of fact, this water tank is still standing. You can see it down there today. This was the power plant. This was the power plant here. These were labs. These were chemical. These were the sulfuric acid. This is the general view of the acid area. You can see there were a lot of lines. They had a lot of steam lines were above ground, and they had water lines below ground. It's a general area. You can see these are large structures. Some of them were completely made of wood, some of them were concrete.
See the clouds.
See the clouds? Yeah. 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 Construction began in January of 1942. They actually started the construction. And the Fraser Brace was the company that was in charge of the construction, and Fraser Brace was the company that actually operated the plant. The Army Ordnance was in charge of the whole operation. It was basically, and then Fraser Brace did the operation, day-to-day operations, and they also had the General Chemical Company, which ran the labs and the chemical part of it. The cost of building the plant at that time was approximately $45 million. Now, they started the construction in January of 42. By October of 1942, the first TNT came off the line. So they put up 500 and some buildings from January to October of 1942. So you can imagine the magnitude of what was going on here. Employment at the peak in the summer of 1942, while they were building it, was 8,000 men and women. That's a lot of people for Crawford County. And later, during the actual operation, it was down to 2,500. And the interesting part is, once they started to manufacture the TNT, they manufactured, and this astounded me, 600,000 pounds of TNT per day. That's a lot of ammunition. That's a lot of TNT. 600,000 pounds per day. So you can see this was no minor operation. This was a major operation. And they recruited workers from all over. They recruited workers mainly Crawford County, of course. They went to Erie, Cambridge Springs, Linesville, Pittsburgh, and Ohio. They even at one point they sent recruiters into the bars in Pittsburgh to drag people out of there to work here. The problem they ran into was a lot of these men, after the first paycheck, a lot of them disappeared, So they had a constant problem with recruiting and keeping workers there. Now, the people in Crawford County, the average person was making probably $11 a week. If you worked at the plant, you were making $24 to $26 a week, so that's a considerable jump in pay. It's a good incentive to work there. I talked to one woman. She worked as a switchboard operator, and she's 92 years old. She worked for Meadville Telephone, and she was walking down Chestnut Street, and a recruiter walked up to her and said, "I understand you work for Meadville Telephone." And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, how much are you making?" And she said, $11 a week. And he said, "How'd you like to work at the KOW?" And she said, "Well, how much will you pay me?" He said, $26 a week. It was a no-brainer. She went. So, and it created a problem, though. We had a lot of people. Meadville's population went from 14,000 to 20,000 people. Where are you going to put all these people? Well, they ended up putting, some of them were housed in Cambridge Springs hotels, Allegheny College. Meadville, you couldn't find a room. They were doubled and tripled up in rooms. If you had a house, you could rent out your bedroom. It was a major problem. And Morgan Village, if you're familiar with it, was a result of the KOW. It was built to house workers. And of course, we all know Morgan Village still exists today. And they also had transportation. Now you had to get the workers there. They had carpools. They also had several buses. They were your standard school buses. They were painted green. As we all know, we're in the military, the green school buses, 60-passenger buses. And they were running those buses to Greenville, Linesville, Cambridge Springs, Edinburgh. And in August of 1942, the KOW buses transported 165,466 workers, 150,736 miles without an accident, or so they say. Now, there were facilities at here, and I'll show you some of these activities for employees that were unheard of in that day and back in there. They had a full-fledged fire department, an amazing 10-bed hospital, which was considered to be quite the thing back then. Cafeteria. They had a weekly newspaper that they called The Blast, and it made the, yeah, I know. And it came out weekly, and it was better. It put the Tribune to shame. We have actually a lot of the original copies of the newspaper, And they had a softball team, rifle teams, drama troupe. They sponsored dances, fun drives. They even had a featured appearance in the 1940s of Fay Ray. Does anybody here who knew who Fay Ray was? Yeah, you're showing your age, Nick. You're showing your age. And the idea was that they wanted, and this is something that corporations do today, but this was first, back then, this was a new idea. You wanted to make your workers feel that they were part of a family, that they belonged to an organization. That way you would keep your workers. If you kept your workers happy, they're going to produce better, they're going to stay with you. So this was an attempt to mainly keep them, the feeling as though they were belonged to a family or an organization. Here's some more photographs. Some of these photographs, now these were classified at the time. There's the work safety. There's the headquarters. There was a colonel who was in charge of the Keystone Ordnance Works, and that changed several times. There were different colonels came and went, as typical of the military. This was the administrative area, the cafeteria. The cafeteria was here. This was one of the main administrative buildings. And of course, we have security, and I'll get into that a little further. We had fencing around it. We had guard shacks. This is one of the guard shacks. And one of the things here you'll notice here, one of the critical things here, of course, common sense, you're making TNT, no matches, no flames, no fires. And they had these signs up around. The workers, when they went in, they were issued, some of them were issued trousers and shirts with no pockets in them, or they had coveralls issued with no pockets in them. They weren't allowed, back then, you understand, 1944, the in thing was to smoke. Everybody smoked. Well, they didn't want anybody smoking, so they didn't give them pockets that they could put cigarettes and matches in. And one of the women that I talked to, or several, said that they would periodically come in where they were working and they would check them to make sure that they didn't have matches or they weren't sneaking out back for a cigarette. That was a definite no-no. But we always have the 10%. There's always one in the crowd. I hope those boxes are empty. I don't know. But there's always one in the crowd that has to, buck the system. Now, of course, we have typical, these are photos that were taken by the Army, typical Crawford County snow. And these are some of the guard, this main entrance.
Do you have any idea what year that was?
No, I don't know. Maybe you do. I don't know.
I'm not that old.
They had a huge
I'm not old.
Did they have a huge snow in 44?
I remember.
45.
Okay, that could be when it is. There's no date on these photographs. These were photographs that were in a file that was marked confidential. And I don't even know why they took some of these photographs. They had a KOW guard shack, and I'll get into that. But you know the old saying, one photograph's worth 1,000 words. So that's why a lot of these photographs, I could sit here and describe these buildings, but to see them, that's the TNT area. And this is one, look at the size of the building there. That building's still standing, and I'll show you later, made out of wood. And the amount of lumber that they use just to put up that building, I would imagine today to build a plant like this would be an astronomical amount of money. I mean,
Take your number and multiply it by about 35.
About 35. You're probably right. It would be just unbelievable. Now, I want you to note on here, this is what they called, these were tri-houses. They called tri-houses, bi-houses. You notice this is on stilts, and I want you to notice right here, this particular. Yeah, you'll see that in a minute. I'll show you something here shortly. This was the fire department. This was a water cooler. Look at the size of that. If you look at the vehicles there and you look at the size of that water cooler, we see coolers on top of a building. Look at the size of that, the enormity of it.
You know what they used it for, Diane? When you're manufacturing sulfuric acid, it gets hot.
So that'd be for the sulfuric. That's interesting.
That would be the cooler thing.
To cool the sulfuric. Yeah, one of the problems with the chemicals was you generated heat. That was a problem. And that was something that they carefully monitored.
You bet.
and I'll get into that. Here's some more photos of the different buildings. And you could get into each one of these buildings and go do a whole talk on what each one of these buildings is. I'm just giving you an overview. These are some of the chemical tanks that were there, the ammonia tanks. Looks like something out of Star Trek, but these are some of the buildings. You say there was, I believe, 506 buildings total when this was done. This was a sulfuric acid house.
What did they put sulfuric acid in to keep it from eating the bottom out of the tank?
I don't know. That's something I couldn't tell you.
Were they glass or something?
Ceramic, yeah.
I'm guessing they were probably a ceramic of some sort. You would have a problem there.
They have to be, we just eat the bottom right out of it.
You see there were a lot of the lines, these were steam lines that were running. These are just a maze of lines above ground. And I'd hate to even think what's below ground. I mean, kill that person.
Sorry.
Like that advertisement.
I got it shut off.
There's some TNT in it.
There's a 10%, there we go. And they had the rail system here. And sometimes between the buildings, when they would package up the TNT, they would put it on wooden dollies on tracks and run it to what they would call the shipping buildings. Everything, they tried to avoid as much metal as possible. This was the power plant, which is still standing, by the way, that was there.
Coal burning?
Coal burning, and they had the railroad siding right here beside, and they would take it up into the plant, and there's another photograph here. Look at the amount. I wouldn't even hazard a guess at how much coal per day they had to burn. It had to be an astronomical amount of coal. You can just see they've got a bulldozer here moving the coal.
Today, Obama wouldn't allow them to use coal.
Probably not. Now, you manufacture TNT. It was shipped out by truck or by rail, but obviously you had to store the TNT somewhere. So they have an area, the magazine area, and today it's 2 miles south of the main complex. You obviously wouldn't want to store a lot of ammunition near your plant. If you had an accident or something exploded, you're in big trouble. So 2 miles away, and the bunkers that they built, and I'll go into detail, were commonly called the igloos. But they were concrete bunkers, and they were laid in rows, and they were located about 2 miles away from the thing, and they were constructed of concrete. They were 60-foot long, 27-foot wide, and the walls were 10-foot high, 12-inch thick with wooden roofs, and it took approximately 90 tons of concrete per bunker to build these. And there were 100 of them, and they were in 8 rows, and they were staggered. They staggered them, and the reason these bunkers, this is a picture of one of the bunkers, they staggered the bunkers across from each other because you didn't want a chain reaction. The reason they were designed this way, they piled dirt around them, and the idea was if there was an explosion, it would direct the explosion upward. They didn't want to have a chain reaction, have it blow out to the sides and set off the other bunkers. So it was specifically designed to the concrete floor, the concrete walls, wooden roof, so if there was a blast, it would direct most of it would go upward instead of outward. And they used 90 tons of concrete per each one of these. A lot of concrete. And this is some of the bunkers as they look today. The bunkers are still there, a majority of them. They're still there. Back in the 60s, they allowed people to buy some of these bunkers. And some of the people, they're very ingenious. You can see the concrete walls there. They're actually, they're perfect for inside in the summer. They're warm in the winter, they're cool in the summer. One of the problems that I had when I was with the state police was we had to go down there constantly evict squatters out of there. People would just literally move in there and live. No plumbing, no heating, no electric, but they would live there. And we had to constantly go down there and kick them out of there. I mean, it was just, of course, if you're a homeless person, it's the perfect place to be. This is what's left of some of them today. But good old American ingenuity. Some people bought the bunkers and they converted them into their homes. Very ingenious. You actually had your walls already made. These are just some of the ones. And Greenwood Township, not to be outdone, took some of the bunkers and used them for storage. And there's another storage building. And one farmer, there you go, the perfect barn. You had the concrete floors for the cows, and you were set to go. Now, they also had an area for because this was an Army ordinance, you had officers there. You had lieutenants, captains, colonels. You had to have a place for them to stay, and of course, they had staff housing. And if you come up the road from Route 19 coming up to PPG, it's still called Staff Avenue, you had a series of bungalows here that were built for the officers. And they're still in existence today. Now, these are the staff houses back then. By today's standards, they weren't very plush, but by back then, they were considered fairly decent. I'm sure some of you ladies can recall kitchens like this before we had the microwaves and the dishwashers. And these are what they look like today. They're still standing. People, they're privately owned, and they're used as private residences. This was a trailer camp that was there for some of the employees. These were some of the vehicles were used. These are 42 Chevy pickups and GMCs was mainly what they used. They used these for maintenance, patrol. Some of these were used as an ambulance. This was something that I wasn't aware of until recently, that they had their own trains, their own engines. And these were built up by General Electric in Erie. I talked to a fellow that's a historian for General Electric. He supplied me. They shipped one in 1942, 1943, 1945. These were specifically built for the KOW, and you can see on the side of it, there's a close-up, KOW. So they actually built diesel engines specifically for the Keystone Ordnance. This engine here, this is presently at the South Branch Valley Railroad in Moorefield, West Virginia. It's still being used. It's down, it's been painted yellow. And the Railroad Association would love to bring this thing back.
Yeah, I'll bet.
That would be quite a project. Here's the 10-bed hospital. Dr. Bates was one of the doctors that was. Did you know him?
I knew him very well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there he is. There's the hospital. There's the nurses. And this is the Dr. R.E. Carey. There were different doctors came and went. Some of the girls there. The cafeteria. This is the Keystone Blast, the newspaper. These are the girls that worked in the lab. And amazingly, majority of the employees were women. A lot of them were women, because you've got to bear in mind the war's going on. Most of the men are off fighting the war. So the women. I talked to two of the women that were in the lab. One girl was out of high school, had no background in chemistry whatsoever. They sent her to Allegheny College, and there was a doctor there, you may know, I can't recall his name. They trained her there for several weeks. And then she went to work in the lab, and they were each given specific duties to do. And here's...
Dr. Pyle?
Wasn't Lou Pyle, was it?
What I like about this picture is you notice here, enemy ears. And there they are.
Girls in the glasses.
Yeah. Now, they had a guard. Obviously, you had security was tight. You had to have security tight. And they had a guard unit there. They had a military police force. They had 3 companies of 100 men each. They had 2 fences surrounding the ordnance. Security was very tight. One woman said she worked there, and her brother came up one day to visit her, and he drove up to the main gate, and he had a camera in the back seat of the car. Bam, they took the camera. There was one man that was fired about a month after he was employed because they caught him inside trying to take photographs. And he was arrested by the federal government because you were absolutely forbidden to take any photographs. Security, they came in through the gates on the bus. Called the Keystone, that's their flag, their badge of the chief. These are photographs of the security guards. I particularly like the vehicles in the background, and you can see there's women there. This guy there scares the heck out of me. He looks like somebody you wouldn't want to mess with. And this was part of the guard unit, and when I first saw this, I thought, well, that looks exactly, it's almost a copy of the state police uniform. And they were equipped with patrol cars, and they had horses. They brought in, at one point, 48 horses. They tried to do a mounted troop. And I'll show you here in a minute. They brought in the mounted troop. They brought in Army personnel to train them to ride the perimeters. You got 15,000 acres. You got a lot of area to cover. Here's part of the mounted troop. This was Lyle Horn. He's a local resident. I got this photograph from his son. But they had problems. The mounted troop didn't work out real well. They had it for a short period of time, but they were having some problems with it, so it didn't work out as well as what they thought. It's hard to take some men that haven't ridden before and teach them how to ride a horse and do it in a short period of time. Yeah, this is his dad here. Is that your dad? No, that's not my dad. And they had a 3-day training school. This was one of the uniform. Guard Ewing put his bonds in. For not to outdo the women, they came up with a special uniform, and occasionally at night she would fly around the complex and check things out. Here's some of the men who worked the TNT crew. You can see the coveralls, no pockets. Now the TNT, the flake TNT, was placed in, when they shipped it, they put it in 50-pound boxes. They were lined, and they poured the flake TNT, and that's the way they were shipped, in 50-pound boxes. And I happen to have here is one of the boxes that they used. Pat Emick had this box in his collection. This is just one of the forms of TNT, half-pound, that you could make.
Was that stuff inert when it was in that form?
It was inert, yeah.
Exploded?
No, it was fairly inert.
What were they worried about the fire?
And then see, this is them packing the boxes. That's the kernel, that's the last TNT. This is a photograph of one of the, yeah, they would line these boxes. They were lined with like a metal, or not a metal, but a plastic liner of some sort. And they would occasionally take it out and do some quality control testing. These are some of the trucks that they used to transport it. And these were called angel wagons, obviously. I wouldn't want to drive one of them, but Keystone, they boast a fine safety record. There's some more engineering testing. And these are some of they would move them from building to building on these wooden skids. And here we have, as I pointed out to you before, you see these ramps, and this is one of my favorite photographs. They were in these buildings, they were mixing these chemicals, they had, temperature control was critical. If it overheated, it got to a certain temperature, they were told to bail, get out now, you only have minutes to get out of the building. If it got out of control, they constantly monitored the temperature of these chemicals, and they had these chutes. And instead of ladders, you went out, they trained them to slide down the chutes. Some of them, at the chemical part, they had showers at the bottom of the chutes where they would shower them off. One of the problems there, too, that they had was the women, when they worked in what they called the flake houses, during the manufacturing process, you had a lot of this powder in the air. And the chemicals would react with the women's hair, and a lot of the women went in there as blondes, came out as redheads. It was a temporary thing. So the women quickly learned to wear what we call babushkas, or scarves over their head. And I talked to the one woman, she said, yeah, she came out of there and she was redhead, she became a redhead. So it was a chemical reaction with the dust that was in the air. But these were the chutes that they used. These are some of the personnel there. This is some of the propaganda they put out. You can see they wanted office employer operations, the different various positions that they were advertising for. Back the attack with work at Keystone. Keystone Blast, that's the paper. They had a barracks there for some of the men, 1,200 men. And one of the things you wore there was each person, you wore badges. They were color-coded badges. Security was strict. You were restricted to one particular area. You didn't know what was going on in the room next to you, let alone the building next to you. You were given a color-coded badge. You were restricted to go to a certain area, and that's where you had to go. And I talked to some of their former employees. They had no idea what was going on in the rest of the plant. They knew what their job was, and this was for security reasons. And the one fella, I don't know whether he's here today, was a newspaper boy at the plant, and he had a white badge, and he was the only one that was allowed, outside of the administrators, he had free access to the complete plant, because he went over every morning at 5 o'clock with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and sold them for a nickel a copy, and they gave him carte blanche. He could go anywhere he wanted to, and he sold newspapers there.
And this gentleman here.
And tell them about it. This is the gentleman here. How old were you at the time?
15.
15.
Yeah.
And you sold the Post-Gazette?
Yeah, because there's many people in the Pittsburgh area, it sold better than the Tribune.
Anything sells better than the Tribune. But you were allowed, you had a white badge, and you were permitted to go anywhere that you wanted to go.
Any place I wanted. Even when a Canadian plane crash landed up there one time, that scared everybody. They didn't know where it come from. It lost its radio system and run out of fuel and got to land on one of the streets. Instead, it landed on the wrong side of the lights.
Okay.
I'll fix it.
It's
Okay.
for the landing gear out under, the 4 Canadians on it didn't get hurt. I talked to them, and I was able to ride my bicycle down there.
Yeah, you were, yeah.
Then I usually try to get back out at 19 to catch school bus. Sometimes I did, then I quit
Then you quit.
early.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. He had carte blanche. He could go anywhere he wanted. Everybody else. Now, you took the photographs. You can see from this isn't like the driver's exam. You don't go up there and you get to take 4 or 5 and you pick the best one. You stuck your head through a white sheet and they took your photograph. That was it. And as you can see by the badges, they weren't very flattering. These are some of the badges. Now, this would be a badge for probably an administrator, somebody high up in the hierarchy. They had a badge they were allowed to go wherever they wanted. Probably similar to what you had.
That's interesting.
And now, during the time that the plant was in operation, we had the war going on. We had what they called bond rallies to raise money. Money was a critical thing at the time. And they had bond rallies. They held them at the Keystone Ordnance. And one of the rallies that they had in 1942, they had this woman here. She was a famous Filipino singer. This was an aviator that got shot down and lost his legs. And they would hold these bond rallies. Now, these are photos that were taken by the Army. I don't know who. This was probably somebody administratively. But here's a bond rally being held at the KOW. Look at the amount of people there. And they would get up and they would give talks. And one of the things you'll notice here was one of the ways to raise money was you could have your name put on a box of TNT. Wouldn't fly today. But you could pay to have your name put on a box of TNT. And you can see here's the buses that I referred to that they use for transporting people. They had a whole fleet of these buses. Now, one of the other things was in summer 1943, one of the things they wanted to do to raise money was during Pearl Harbor, first day of Pearl Harbor, there were 5 Japanese submarines attacked Pearl Harbor. One of them was beached, and they captured one of the crewmen. Well, the submarine that they captured, the Navy took it, and of course they tore it apart for information. They decided to take it and put it on tour. They put a plexiglass window in it, they put it on a flatbed trailer, and they took it on tour around the United States to raise money. And people would say, you'd pay a quarter or 50 cents, you could walk up and actually look inside a Japanese submarine. And it was a great fundraiser for them.
It was a one-man submarine.
The two-man submarines. And this was one, this was in the Keystone Ordnance Works, and I'd seen this, and 2 years ago, a fellow came into the Historical Society, and he said, I have these photos I took. I was going to throw them away. Would you be interested in them? And I took one look at them and said, yes, we would be interested, because these are the photos he took. July 1943 Stone Church Diamond. This is actual photos of people lined up at the diamond, and you can see they put a wooden platform. You could walk up on the side of the platform, and you could look inside of the submarine. You could actually get to see a Japanese two-man submarine. It was a great fundraiser. These are some of their security guards. This is state policemen back then. And these are great photos. You can see it's on the flatbed. Okay, now the KOW was in operation from October 1942 until February of 1944. It was deactivated, a total of actually 15 months. Then it was reactivated again for a short period of time, October 1944 to August of 45, which would be VJ Day. They claim at the time there wasn't a single loss of life, and the government supposedly did a decontamination on it at a cost of $45 million. They claim that they decontaminated it. So I don't know. In 1964, the KOW was sold to the Meadville Industrial Complex for $500,000, and that was Keebert. And he gave them the money to buy it, and eventually it ended up Keebert owned it. And the story goes he actually made his money back because he sold the fill from the roads and the asphalt he recycled, so he actually made back his investment. It was a good move.
Sir, there was one building out there that contained a lot of brass fittings, and he got his money back just from the scrap.
Probably did. Well, just the scrap metal alone from that, and the buildings that are still standing today, the scrap metal value is, worth probably millions. In June of 1966, they had a public auction. They had all this equipment. I'm going to go through this quickly. And the General Chemical Company in New York purchased a lot of the machinery. They paid $508,000 for it. But just to give you an idea of the amount of equipment, I'm going to go through these kind of fast because I want to. This was the auction in '66. These tanks, these were all sold off. Look at the amount of equipment here. You have lathes, hundreds of lathes. This is the KOW today. Today, the industrial PPG built their plant where the administrative area would be. Rusco's in there, Aero Forge. We also have parts of it where we had the National Guard had their, and they still have their firing range and storage areas in part of it. Now we have a tire plant going in down there. This is a view. This shows PPG, and this is, of course, this is where the TNT lines were, the chemical plant. Last year, I flew over in an airplane and I took some aerial photographs, which I'll show you here, to show you how it looks today, what's left of the plant. This was one of the, see, these are some of the buildings, the original buildings from where they manufactured. This is the power plant. This is part of the chemical labs over here. This would have been the administrative area at one time. That's the power plant. These are the chemical labs. Some of the water towers are still there. You can see them there today. Pretty grown over right now. That's what's left of the oleum plant and the waste plant. They're pretty substantial structures. I believe Aero Forge uses this building. These are part of the buildings to the buildings on the TNT manufacturing line. These buildings are still standing, and you can see there's a lot of metal in those buildings, a lot of scrap value in those buildings. I'm going to go through these kind of fast because
Sandy, what kind of roofs would be on those?
the metal roofs. The building's all metal. These are showing you what's there today, the remnants of what's left of the actual plant. There's the power plant. It's the interior of the power plant. I first gave this talk and I saw this here and I thought, I mistakenly said, well, this must have been a chute that an auger they used to bring the coal in. And after I got done with the speech, one of the old farmers came up and he said, I didn't want to interrupt you, but he said, I used to store my cows in there and that's what we used to bring the feed in. So, looking at the age of it, I thought, well, this was something that was used, and he said no, because later on, a lot of the farmers used those fields for their cattle, and he said, no, he said, I put that auger in there, that's what I used to bring the grain in for my cattle. So I said, okay. This is what happens to a keg of nails after 50-some years. It becomes a solid mass. Some more of the buildings, the tanks. This is what's left of the one building. And you can see the size of these buildings, the amount of lumber that they use just to put the one building. This would have been the labs, inside the labs. Now inside these are all tile. They're all tile floors, maybe because of working with the chemicals. Oh, yeah. These are inside the building. It's all lined with tile. There's a...
So the dust from the chemical wouldn't penetrate it.
Right, yeah.
If it's penetrated, it can blow up.
Well, one story was a fellow told me that they were working on one of the trucks and he was doing some welding on it and there was dust underneath the truck from the chemicals, and he said all of a sudden the truck started going off like a sparkler from the dust and that. And this is there's a lot of underground plumbing there, wires, pipes, etc. This is just to give you an idea of what's left there today. This was where one of the areas where they would box up the materials. There's, I believe, probably 51, maybe 52 structures left. This is the rail siding. These are some of the original storage houses for the railroad. A lot of them are falling down. The loading docks. That's PPG in the background there. Now this is their fire department. You notice the 2 fire trucks here. I was down there several years ago at where the station was, and here are the fire trucks as they look today, sitting outside. Well, this was before. This was taken in 1992. This is taken a few years ago. This is what's left of the fire trucks. Unfortunately, and I don't know why they didn't try to preserve them or put them, but they were, yeah, there's not much left of them now. And this was manufactured in 1941, I believe, half-ton fire truck. Now, it was interesting on the vehicles, they all stamped U.S. property. In other words, if you stole a tire and it had U.S. property on it, you were in big trouble. This was a steamroller that was down there many years ago. Some of the equipment. And this is as it looks today. This is what's left of it. It's a fading memory. It's to older county residents, and most of the younger residents don't even know that it existed. And today, cattle are grazing where there was once a munitions plant. So this is just to give you an overview, an idea of what was there and what's gone now. And I thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. And trying to condense a lot into a small, you could take each aspect of this and do a whole talk on it. But just to give you an idea of what was there. A lot of people go down there and I get the question asked, what are those buildings? You can see them and they don't know what they are. And you say KOW or TNT and they look at you with a blank look. They have no idea what was there. But it was the economy, it boosted the economy of Crawford County. Geneva was booming, Meadville was booming. They tell me, you could go to Meadville on a Friday or Saturday night and it was wall-to-wall people. Mm-hmm. You had a lot of workers there. They had money in their pockets. They were being well paid for the time. So it was definitely a boon to Crawford County, and it is one of the most, it's fascinating How I got interested in it was my sister-in-law called me, and my mother-in-law worked in the cafeteria. And I was aware of what it was and where it was. And I started to, she wanted some information, and as I started to research this thing, the more I got into it, the more fascinated I became and realized the magnitude of this plant, how big it was. It wasn't a small operation, it was an extremely big. And it was actually 15 months it was actually in operation, but they produced, and a lot of the ammunition was used in the Pacific War. So it was very instrumental in helping in the war. It was a very important facility, and I think Crawford County can be proud of the fact that we had it here, that it was done here. So, and I thank you for your time.